So you've been working on the Northwest Coast for some time during your career. How did you become aware of the Cathlapotle site, and how did your involvement develop over the years?
Started when I was hired at Portland State. I was hired in part to start a local archaeological project, and that's the first project. First excavation was done at a site near Scappoose, Oregon, called the Meier site, which is the name of the landowner. And we had worked there for about 5 years. And the Meier site contains the remains of a really large plankhouse. It's about 90 feet long by about 55 feet wide. And so we'd gotten a lot of experience excavating one of these things. And it also was the late dates from about 1400 to 1820. So we had a lot of experience with that. So Fish and Wildlife Service, on whose refuge Cathlapotle is located, came to me, Aidan Raymond, who's the regional archaeologist, came to me in 1991, wanting to know if we would be interested in a project over there because they needed to locate Cathlapotle, and they needed to find out what kind of, it was supposed to be in the refuge, find it and assess what kind of condition it was in. And then they wanted to use the site as part of public outreach and public education. So, and they were going to pay for the work. And so, oh, that sounds like a good plan to me, because one of the problems we were having at Meier was getting it funded. So we went over there and looked for it and couldn't find it. Archaeologists, there's a big meadow and there's a cotton stand and things like that. And archaeologists had wanted to put it in the meadow, or a couple meadows, and wanted to put it in the meadows. I think because the meadows were more hospitable. But we went into the woods, and then the landowner, who was a man named Jim Carty, told us that his family had found beads and stuff in the dirt in the woods, and they had assumed they were from tree burials. So we went and looked, and we thought, well, this looks a lot like what we would expect it to be like. And then there was a real hard freeze, so all the stinging nettles died. And we could actually see the ground surface. And we looked in and said, yes, this is clearly has to be it. We did a couple limited excavations to demonstrate that was the truth. Carty, after that, decided no longer to be cooperative, and there were some other things. We also found little holes in the ground. It looks like the Carty's explorations in the site were more extensive than he said, but that's how we found it. It wasn't any sort of heavy-duty methodological, lots of equipment kind of thing. We talked to people and walked around in the woods and looked at the dirt.
And of course it was mentioned in the written records.
Well, the written record, yes. We knew roughly where it had to be. I'm sorry. It was first when the Vancouver expedition sent a Lieutenant Broughton up the river in 1792. Broughton was greeted by multiple canoes, some 40-odd canoes filled with warriors from a village across the river. This was at Warrior Rock, hence the name, on Sully Island. And they were there, and they were greeted by these warriors from a very large village across the way. And then Lewis and Clark stopped at Cathlapotle. They mentioned Cathlapotle on the way downstream, and then they stopped there. They were invited by the people from the village. They were stopped there on the way back upstream, spent an afternoon, left a very full account. And then Cathlapotle played a role in the fur trade in Hudson's Bay after that. So it's mentioned in a number of accounts between 1806, Lewis and Clark, and the late 1820s. The mentions in the 1830s talk about how it's abandoned. And so it's also mentioned, people from Cathlapotle were also mentioned in documents from Fort Astoria, Fort George in the 1811, 1812, 1813. So we knew where it had to be. I don't want to say we didn't know where, but then locating it using those early 19th century maps and then locating exactly was where the difficulty was.
And what kinds of features in the physical landscape give you clues?
If you know what you're looking for, Cathlapotle is really obvious. In contrast to Meier had been plowed. And so there was no visible surface indications that Meier was there. Well, there was stuff on the surface and things that was left from the house being there. But at Cathlapotle was never, the surface was intact. It was extraordinarily intact. over the it was abandoned sometime in the 1830s. So in the 160 years, 170 years between the time it was abandoned and the time we got there, very little had happened to that surface except for trees. So the surface of the site contained 6 large depressions, long linear depressions, which which preserved the outlines of the structures. Locally, people had cellars. The houses were partially semi-subterranean. They excavated out areas, piled the dirt on the side. But these houses also had cellars, which made the depressions even deeper. So you get the depression is exaggerated because they dug it out and they piled the dirt on the side, so the sides are raised. But that can mimic natural features, river features called scroll bars, where you get low bars, and little levees, and then low places, little levees, and low places. We think what they actually did was found a place where the scroll bars were about the right size apart and excavated them down and piled dirt. Well, we don't think that, we know that. And piled dirt on top of the bars and exaggerated that landform. But it fooled us at first. We saw some other scroll bars and we tested them and there were scroll bars. So they took advantage of that for their architecture. So what the site has is these long, in one case like 200 feet long, in another case it's 140 feet long, these big depressions, and then in front of them, between the depressions and in front of them are dumps, trash, where people piled up their trash. What's unusual or extraordinary about Cathlapotle, to get back to the surface indications, is that the houses were not one single structure, but they were made by constructing smaller houses together, compartments end to end, very tightly, and then probably piercing the walls with doors. And what happened at Cathlapotle is that dirt would accumulate between the 2 house walls, and then the walls would rot after the site was abandoned. And at Cathlapotle, those little strips of mounted dirt are preserved. So these long depressions are crossed by very low ridges which show you where the end walls were. And if the site had been plowed once, all of that would be gone. So I've seen other places where you get this kind of preservation. It's very unusual. And you need a place where people leave it and nobody ever comes back. And that's what happened at Cathlapotle. So Cathlapotle is located at the confluence of Lake River, which drains Vancouver Lake, at the Columbia G Creek, which is this little creek that comes down off the uplands in Washington, and the Lewis River. They all come together near Cathlapotle, and across the Columbia Soddy Island, very close to Scappoose Bay and Multnomah Channel. So, and then immediately behind Cathlapotle, there's a whole complex set of wetlands. And then immediately behind that, you get into the uplands, which are known locally as the Fourth Plain area, and those places where you get, it's a few hundred feet above the river, and these big rolling flat areas in Clark County. And then, but the Lewis River and G Creek gets you also fairly quickly into the foothills of St. Helens and things like that. So it's very strategically located. One of my students did a view shed analysis of Cathlapotle, both in terms of what you could see if you were standing on the roofs of one of the houses, estimating how high the houses were, and then also what you could see sitting in a boat off Warrior Rock. And if you're in the river, you can only see, there's only a small window of opportunity to see Cathlapotle. If you're coming up and down the river, you can only see it from Warrior Rock, and you can only see it for a very brief period of time. If you're standing on a roof of Cathlapotle, assuming no trees, you can see far upriver and far downriver, except for immediately behind Deer Island. So the site is virtually invisible from the river, but it commands a view, the way it's situated, up and down, because of being down, commands a significant view up and down the river. So you say it's strategically located. It's strategically located both in terms of resources, but it's also strategically located both in terms of its ability to command the river, and it's defensively located because they'll know you're coming, but you won't know they're there. It's really cool.
Apart from the preservation of the site, what things make it unique in the archaeological world?
Well, you can't exclude that. The preservation, the site's extraordinary because preservation extends beyond the surface. It's got, organic, not all organics in it, but plant remains, animal remains, tools, all those kinds of things, unless it's made out of fiber, are preserved. So the preservation is extraordinary, and that makes it a very rich site. And that richness allows archaeologists to attack a whole series of questions. Another thing that's also well preserved in the site is the stratigraphy is very, very, very good. It's very clear. It hasn't been disturbed. And so the contact, the shift from pre-contact to contact is very clearly marked. So you can identify, well, this is pre-contact and this is contact. So you can look at the impact of the first 50 years of contact on the people at Cathlapotle. You can tease that out. And so it's a very extraordinary window into the period from 1450 to 1830. And it has enough extraordinary amount of material. So it's not one of those things where you say, well, I think we could say something about this. We have 20 of these, and now at Cathlapotle you'll have 790 of them. The site is just full of material.
So you've located the remains for a number of plank houses.
Right, we've located the remains of 6, at Cathlapotle there are 6 really big ones.
But you haven't excavated all of those.
No.
What's your strategy with them?
Well, partially we thought our strategy is to sample. Our first notion at Cathlapotle was that we would be there for 10 years. We started from 1994 to 2004, and after the second year we realized that we didn't have the resources to cope with it. And so we sort of stepped back and focused on House 1 and House 4, House 1 being the largest one, House 4 being one of the 2 smaller ones. So we thought, okay, we'll look at a big one and a little one. And so we focused on those 2. Another strategy would have been just to do distributed units kind of randomly or some other way, just to kind of get a sample across. But we really wanted to get a good sample. We wanted to do a good sample from 2 houses and then the exterior areas around them.